You are standing on the bank of the Nile 3,000 years ago. But you are not where you think you are. You're not in Egypt. Not yet. You are far to the south, deep in what today we call Sudan, in a kingdom that Egypt once conquered, once taxed, once looked down on as a land of nothing but gold and slaves. And you are watching an army get ready to march. At its head is a king with skin as dark as the fertile earth of the river, wearing a crown fitted with not one but two cobras. A symbol that says something staggering. It says, "I do not rule one kingdom. I rule two. I am the Lord of the South, and I am about to become the Lord of Egypt itself. His name is Piye, and in a few months, he is going to march north, sweep down the length of the Nile, conquer the entire ancient superpower that had dominated his people for centuries, and crown himself pharaoh of all Egypt. He and his line will rule the whole thing, the pyramids, the temples, the throne of the pharaohs, for the better part of a century. History remembers them by a name that sounds almost like a legend, the Black Pharaohs. And here is the question that should stop you cold. Egypt is the most famous ancient civilization on earth. We learn about it as children. We know Tutankhamun, we know Cleopatra, we know the pyramids at Giza. So how is it that an African kingdom from deep in the heart of the continent once conquered and ruled all of Egypt, produced a whole dynasty of pharaohs, and almost none of us were ever taught their names? And how is it that the land they came from, Sudan, actually contains more pyramids than Egypt does? And you have probably never seen a single photograph of them. Let's get into it. To understand the Black Pharaohs, you first have to understand the kingdom they came from, because it was old, and it was powerful, and it was nobody's little brother. It was called Kush. Kush sat on the Nile south of Egypt, in a region the Egyptians called Nubia. And the two civilizations had one of the longest relationships in all of ancient history. Thousands of years of trade, war, marriage, rivalry, and mutual influence flowing up and down the river. For long stretches, Egypt was on top. Egyptian armies pushed south, built fortresses, and controlled Nubia, hauling away its fabulous gold. So much gold that the region's very name may be tied to the Egyptian word for it. To Egypt, Nubia was the treasure house, the source of the wealth that gilded the pharaohs. But here is what the old story leaves out. Kush was not just a mine. It was a sophisticated society with its own kings, its own gods, its own great cities on the river, Kerma and later Napata, and later still the dazzling city of Meroë. And around the 8th century before the Common Era, the balance of power did something nobody expected. Egypt fell into weakness and division, split into squabbling little states. Its central authority collapsed. And down in the south, Kush had grown strong, unified, and confident. The student had outgrown the teacher, and the teacher was on the floor. And there is one more thing you have to understand, because it is the key to everything Piye did. Deep in Kush, near the capital of Napata, there stands a strange, flat-topped sandstone mountain called Jebel Barkal. And to both the Egyptians and the Kushites, this mountain was holy, one of the most sacred places on earth, believed to be a home of the great god Amun himself, the king of the gods. For centuries, both peoples had worshipped Amun there, so when the Kushite kings looked at their claim to Egypt, they did not see themselves as outsiders reaching for a foreign crown. They saw themselves as the keepers of Amun's holiest mountain, the truest servants of Egypt's own supreme god, and therefore the ones with the deepest right of all to sit on Egypt's throne. Piye did not march north to steal Egypt. In his own mind, he marched north because the god of Egypt had chosen him, a son of the sacred mountain, to save it. So Piye looked north at a fractured Egypt, and he saw not a master, but a mess that needed a king. and he decided he was that king. We actually know the story of his conquest in remarkable detail because Piye did something wonderful for us. After he won, he had the entire campaign carved onto a giant stone slab, a victory stele, in careful hieroglyphs. And it survived. It is one of the most vivid war accounts to come out of the entire ancient world, and it does not read like the boast of a barbarian invader. It reads like the account of a devout, disciplined, almost obsessively pious king who believed the gods had sent him to restore order to a holy land that its own rulers had let rot. Piye marched north and took city after city, and the stele records these amazing details, like the fact that Piye was furious at his own soldiers when they slaughtered enemies he wanted spared, and that he stopped to worship at temples along the way, and that when the northern princes finally surrendered and came to submit to him, he was disgusted that some of them, being ritually unclean, could not even enter his palace. This is not a man who saw himself as a foreigner sacking Egypt. This is a man who saw himself as the true, rightful, righteous pharaoh, more Egyptian than the Egyptians, come to clean house. And that is exactly how he ruled. Piye and his successors, his brother Shabaka, and the greatest of them all, Taharqa, didn't erase Egyptian culture. They embraced it, revived it, and poured resources into it. They restored ancient temples that had crumbled. They brought back old religious traditions. They commissioned art and building in the classic Egyptian style, looking back to the glory days 1,000 years before them. Under the Black Pharaohs, Egypt experienced a genuine renaissance, a proud return to its own ancient roots, led by kings from the south. The high point was Taharqa. Under him, the empire of the Black Pharaohs stretched from deep in Sudan all the way to the edge of the Mediterranean, one of the largest empires in the ancient world at that moment, ruled from an African dynasty rooted in Kush. Taharqa built monuments up and down the Nile. He was so powerful and so significant that he actually appears in the Hebrew Bible named as a king who marched out to challenge the mighty Assyrian Empire. Think about that. A Kushite pharaoh from the heart of Africa, striding across the stage of world history, tangling with the superpowers of the age, remembered in scripture read by billions of people who have no idea he was an African king of Egypt. So what happened? If they were this powerful, why did the Black Pharaohs fade from the story? The answer is iron, and the enemy was Assyria. The Assyrian Empire to the northeast was the terrifying military machine of the age, and crucially they had mastered iron weapons on a large scale, while the Egyptian and Kushite forces still leaned heavily on bronze. The Assyrians invaded, and in a series of brutal campaigns, they did what had seemed impossible. They broke the Black Pharaohs' hold on Egypt. Taharqa's successor was driven all the way back south. The Kushites lost Egypt. But, and this is the part the story almost always drops, losing Egypt was not the end of Kush. Not remotely. The Black Pharaohs retreated south back to their homeland, and there they did not collapse. They flourished. They ruled on as a rich and independent African kingdom for nearly 1,000 more years. And this is where we get to those pyramids. Because when people say pyramids, they picture Egypt, Giza, the three big ones. But if you want to see the land with the most pyramids on earth, you do not go to Egypt. You go to Sudan. The kingdom of Kush, in its later centuries centered on the city of Meroë, built pyramids by the hundreds, rows upon rows of them, clustered in great royal cemeteries in the desert. By many counts, Sudan contains around 200 pyramids, more, possibly far more than exist in all of Egypt. Say that again slowly because it genuinely rearranges the furniture in your head. There are more ancient pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. The country with the most pyramids in the world is a black African nation south of Egypt. and most people on Earth have never seen a picture of them. And they are beautiful, and they are distinct. Nubian pyramids are smaller than the giants at Giza, but they are steeper, narrow, tall, and sharp, rising at dramatic angles out of the golden sand, often in tight clusters. They were tombs for the kings and queens of Kush, decorated with their own blend of Egyptian and native Kushite imagery. They stand there today, hundreds of them, in the Sudanese desert, one of the greatest concentrations of ancient monuments anywhere on the planet, and one of the least visited, least photographed, least talked about. And Meroë, the city they surrounded, was no backwater. It was a thriving center of ironworking. The Kushites eventually mastered the very iron technology that had once beaten them, a hub of trade linking the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean and beyond. They developed their own writing system, Meroitic, moving beyond Egyptian hieroglyphs to a script of their own, a script that, remarkably, we still cannot fully read to this day. There are royal Kushite inscriptions sitting in museums right now that no living person can translate. An entire African civilization is still speaking to us in a language we have not yet cracked. And Kush did something else the old story never tells you. It was, at times, ruled by women. Powerful queens. The Kushites called them Kandakis, which is where the name Candace comes from, ruled Meroë in their own right, as full sovereigns, commanding armies and building monuments. And one of them gave us one of the most magnificent acts of defiance in all of ancient history. Her name was Amanirenas. She was a Kandake of Kush, and she had lost an eye in battle. A one-eyed warrior queen leading her people from the front, and her enemy was not some minor rival. Her enemy was Rome. At the height of its power under the Emperor Augustus, Rome pushed south into Kushite territory, and Amanirenas pushed back. Her armies struck Roman forts on the frontier, and, in a detail that should make you sit up, they toppled the statues of the Emperor Augustus that Rome had planted in the conquered towns. And here is what she did with one of them. Her people sawed the bronze head off a great statue of Augustus, the god emperor, the most powerful man in the world, carried it home to Meroë, and buried it beneath the steps of a temple doorway, right at the threshold, so that every single person who walked in to worship would tread on the face of the Roman emperor forever, with every step. And there it stayed, hidden and trampled, for 2,000 years, until archaeologists dug it up in the 20th century, that famous bronze head of Augustus, exactly where a defiant African queen had ordered it buried, so her people could walk on Rome's god-king for eternity. Amanirenas fought Rome long and hard enough that Augustus himself eventually made peace with her on remarkably generous terms, a warrior queen from the African interior negotiating as an equal with the masters of the Mediterranean world, and winning. So let's go back to that riverbank, 3,000 years ago, and the king with the double cobra crown. Piye was not an anomaly. He was not a fluke, a strange footnote where Africa briefly touched Egypt. He was the most visible peak of a civilization that lasted, in one form or another, for thousands of years, that conquered the greatest power of its day, ruled it as pharaohs, retreated, and then built a golden age of its own with hundreds of pyramids and a language we still can't read, and warrior queens who stared down Rome. The Black Pharaohs were written out of the story we inherited for the same reason so much of African history was, because the people who wrote our textbooks could not or would not place a black African dynasty at the very center of the ancient world's most prestigious civilization. It was easier to treat Egypt as somehow separate from the continent it sits on, easier to leave Kush as a blank space on the map to the south, but the stele of Piye still exists, in his own triumphant words. Taharqa is still there in the Bible, and the pyramids of Meroë are still standing in the Sudanese sand, more of them than in all of Egypt, waiting patiently for a world that was taught to look away to finally turn around and see them. They ruled the Nile from the mountains of the south, story lovers. They wore the double crown, and the desert full of their pyramids is still out there tonight, holding its kings, keeping a story that was never gone, only unread, and now you know their names. No,